Hello, I'm Kevin Graham.
And I'm Paul John Dykes.
And welcome to A Celtic State of Mind. Today we're joined by Willie Wilson.
Hi. Welcome to the show, Willie. How are you doing?
Here, thank you.
Now, Willie was one of the founders of the famous Save Our Celts campaign. What year did you found Save Our Celts, Willie?
I think it was 90 into 91. Around about that season we had lost the League Cup final. So just after Brian Dempsey got the sack. So yeah, round about then, 90-91 season I think it was.
I take it there was a long, hard road for you to make the decision to actually start a protest group.
I mean, it was maybe 25 years in the making because of the kind of downfall of Celtic, the kind of mismanagement of it and the lack of investment in it since the 70s. Now, I started going in the early 70s. My dad, my uncles took me along to Celtic Park as a wee boy. But obviously, it's a bit like, do you know when Tony Soprano says that when he comes in, he felt he came in just at the end, it was too late. I feel that with Celtic, we came in just when it was too late. The good times had been, we're never going to see Celtic win a European Cup again. It doesn't change anything about why we go and why we do it, and you've always got that dream. But the reality is, we've come in too late, and I came in especially by the time I started going, the lines were splitting up. So never really got to see the lines, but got to see some great players. But I think from that, the likes of selling Dalglish in the mid-70s and things like that, and selling Nicholas and so on into the 80s, you could see the kind of downward trajectory. But the Aberdeen, the rise of that, there was various things that could have been prevented. And these days in football, there's not a lot you can do about the way UEFA, gerrymander the Champions League. But back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot Celtic could have done to keep the profile high, to keep the standard of player high, to have those players kept together, to build a team around Kenny Dalglish, to build a team around Nicholas, that kind of thing. And they never done it. So it was probably 25 years in the making. It was a series of frustrations over a number of decades. That by the time I think we got to that late 80s, and you could kind of see the shift of power moving. Not just across Glasgow, but across Scotland. Aberdeen weren't a force anymore. Dundee United weren't going to be a force. And there was an opportunity there for Celtic that was being missed. Mm-hmm. So that's really what started it. And it kind of coincided with, obviously, the results, going south big time.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the early 70s when you go to the games, Willie. Was it with your father and your uncles, or was it?
Yeah, so, grew up, kind of background, a lot of guys from Glasgow, traditional working class, worked in the shipyards, kind of mix of kind of Scottish-Irish parentage and whatever. So, there was never any doubt that, Celtic was part of the family. And like that, like any family, you're going to have really good times with your family and really bad times. So, you kind of took that for, as it was. But my whole kind of point was just the fact that, it could be so much better. And how do you make something better? Be trying to change things, be communicating and talking and that kind of stuff to try and do that.
Mm-hmm. Again, two players you mentioned there, Dalglish and Nicholas. Mm-hmm. I think Nicholas more so because the club could have done a lot more to keep him. I mean, he's obviously gone on record since the transfer because it was made up as though he was dying to move away from Celtic. And in many ways, the story he tells is that Celtic were dying to sell him.
Yeah.
Dalglish, there was no way we could keep him at that point. I think, like what you said, you came too late. He realised himself Celtic weren't going to win another European Cup, and that was his ambition.
I think Dalglish had done his tour of duty as well.
He did.
He had done everything.
Oh, there was. I don't think you could decry anybody for wanting to leave it, and that's the case. But if Celtic had shown the ambition that they could have done, so especially after 1972, 73, 74 season, and invested in the team and really built a team around Dalglish and kind of shown that aptitude that we're going to do everything to keep you here, we'll pay you whatever anybody in England can pay you, and we could have done. He probably never got that feeling, and Dalglish only moved didn't move for money, moved for football reasons, to win things, to play in Europe. There was no reason why Celtic 3 years after being in a European semi-final couldn't have done that.
No, you're right. And I think, again, that the change in although the club was controlled by the same few families throughout that period, the change in chairmanship was a pivotal moment in terms of, if you look at the Lisbon Lions team, none of that side were sold when they were at their peak.
Yeah.
The next crop that came through, the best of them were sold. And we found out last week just that Celtic even got an offer for Danny McGrain from Manchester United, something I had never known, but Danny told me that directly. But we sold McCarry, we sold Hay, we sold Dalglish. So there was a complete change, as you say, in trying to invest and build on the talent that we had. Because that Quality Street Gang team that you were watching, they, if you look at them in terms of the group of players, they could have gone on to better things.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at what the Lions done, but the Quality Street Gang, you look at they boys all coming through and the skill and the ability they had, no matter how it ended up. But on paper, they looked better players, better athletes, better footballers, more naturally technically gifted. Now you take probably, we jinky out the Lions, and you take Bobby Murdoch out, but the rest of them, are just physical, fast players, knowing how to play to a certain style. Whereas this next crop coming through, your George Conleys, your Dalglishes, your McGrains, you're talking world-class players here.
Yeah. And the way they describe it as well, Willie, is they learnt through this form of basically working with the Lions day in, day out, and so they got a lot of that experience. And it should have been another decade of dominance domestically. It should have been more semi-finals and finals in Europe. You're absolutely right.
Absolutely, yeah.
By the 80s, the one thing again I would like to bring up is we get told as Scottish football fans of this 1986 Scottish football revolution when Souness came in. It wasn't quite like that when you look at the facts. And Jim has given us loads of spreadsheets and accounts, and Rangers basically in 1986 became the first Scottish club to go into debt. That was the reality of it, wasn't it? And at that time, I think the only thing that slowed down the process of the fan movement, if you like, is we always did something a wee bit special. So we had the centenary season. Takes the focus away a wee bit. So by the early 90s, you're a frustrated fan. You're looking at the club who have failed to invest in the stadium. So the stadium was dilapidated. Failed to invest in the playing staff. The amount of youth that was coming through had dried up significantly. We always had a team of players ready almost to step in. So what was the first sense that you had that a movement is going to happen, we're going to have to group together? Did you make that call? Was it something that you had heard from elsewhere?
I suppose the fanzines. Fanzines are a big part of it, so not the View especially. For me, waiting for that coming out every kind of 4 weeks, it was like the Christmas morning, waiting for it to drop through the door, and just reading things that that likes Jerry Dunbar had written, or Joe Miller and whatever within it, and guys like Brendan O'Hara as well. Just good comment, good insightful stuff that you think that's exactly how I'm feeling. So if I'm feeling this way and these guys are feeling this way, why is nothing happening? So that was really it. And then obviously the same kind of hard group of pals, the kind of core group, we go to the games, boys for Clydebank, and they all felt the same way. So you think, well, can we do anything about it? What will we do? So kind of just thought then, well, why don't we just print leaflets? I'll get that done. I knew somebody that was a printer. Do us 1,000 leaflets. 3 of us went up to the game before Hearts it was and handed them out, and we got a fair bit of abuse. But we handed them out and we got a really good reply, a good return on it. Quite a few hundred people said, oh, I'm interested. And kind of from that, we decided that we'd get together and meet. So we picked a few names, told a few people where we were going and come along on a kind of cold January night, probably, as I said, 25 years or so ago, and or even more than that now, about 28 years ago. And we met in Sundowners in Queen Street, and there was about a dozen guys there just sitting talking away about, what we could do and what we could try and do. And we just thought, okay, we'll start with just putting pressure on. Yeah. Try to get stuff together and see where it goes.
The thing is, we're talking about it now, and you're bringing back so many memories. You're talking about Not the View, getting that monthly. I remember getting handed that in 1987. And at that time, I wanted to read about Paul McStay. I was just a kid, and you were reading about the board and you were reading about the mismanagement at the club. It was a great insight at that time. It's something that you probably wouldn't have expected to be reading about at that age, but we were entering the realms of, if something isn't done, there's going to be severe repercussions. When you met up with a dozen guys in a pub in Glasgow, Did you get a sense that this was the seeds of something that was going to be massive? I mean, I'm not saying that your group started the Takeover, for example, but it certainly started the wheels in motion along with the fanzines. There was a bit of momentum coming together.
Yeah, and I think you I suppose looking back, and we certainly never achieved the aims of what we thought we'd do. That's the first thing to say about that. But, you know, we had a wee spark that started something somewhere along the line, you know, that moved down the road, you know, within a couple of years, the Celts for Change. And, you know, Brendan Sweeney especially, for me, is the one link between the two groups that takes it all the way through. And even to this day, the stuff that Brendan does is for me, is probably, you know, from a fan point of view, the single most important person.
So valuable. And he doesn't like he wouldn't like to stand and talk about it.
No.
You know?
And I mean, it was a funny thing. As me and Brendan, we grew up in Clydebank. I kind of knew him, but I think he was maybe a year younger. I mean, when you're younger, a year's a big difference, you know. But then I was in the railway, working in the railway at the time, and so was he. So kind of paths started crossing, and we stayed on the same, well, you know, within a mile of each other on the same stretch of road in Clydebank. But it was, you know, through talking to Brendan, and I kind of put him in touch with Matt McGlowan to, you know, take forward the kind of Celts for Change stuff, because at that point, my feeling was that, you know, the fans, we could never get more than 500 people coming to talk to us and writing to us and kind of engaging with us. It just seemed to be that point that results always seem to pick up when we were at a crucial kind of junction. You think, you know, we were just fated never to have the disaster that it would need, unfortunately. But I just thought we were already in that disaster. Yeah. 3 or 4 good results, or beating Rangers in a league game, a meaningless league game at Ibrox or something. Just knocking them out a cup competition once every kind of 6 times you play them was the answer to it.
It tempered it, didn't it?
Beating them twice in 7 days.
Yeah. That knocked out the wind right out of ourselves. There's no doubt about it. How can you complain if you're beating Rangers twice in a week and you think, you know, there's a chance here, you know? Mm-hmm. And changing managers always gives everybody fresh, renewed hope, doesn't it?
It does.
You know, when you move from McNeil to Brady to McCarry, you know, no matter what history says about these guys, if you're a fan, you think, this is it now, this is where we'll go, you know.
Well, you know, it's a good point. McNeil goes hero to everybody, mm-hmm. and they replaced him with an untested chap in Liam Brady, but obviously there was a link because he played for Ireland.
Yep.
He comes in, he was renowned as a player all over Europe, and he started throwing money at it. So with your kind of mindset of Celtic not being managed properly, what were you thinking when he's gone out and buying players for $1 million and 1.5 million?
Again, it's the type of players. Mm-hmm. To me, some of the signings that we made at that point, I mean, we wasted a lot of good money on players that shouldn't be. No, I mean, to be fair, it wasn't just Brady that wasted money. Billy McNeil wasted money, and guys like Martin Hayes. So, you know, there's a history, and even today, you know, managers wasting money on signing absolute rank players that you think, why are they there? But I mean, I know what you're saying. On one hand, you're saying invest in the club, and the club's going out there and spending money. But I think if you looked at the type of players that other clubs were signing, so, you know, we never signed any, in my opinion, you know, any world-class defenders. We didn't get guys coming back, England international signing for us, you know. We didn't go for guys that were well-known in other parts of the world. We by and large, we stuck to the British market, and, you know, some of the players, even though on paper, guys like Stuart Slater looked great, and Tony Cascarino looked magic for Ireland, you know, really, they were never Celtic players.
We did get a diamond in Paul Elliott, though.
We did, and obviously we're never going to hang on to him. So, you know, there's always that catch-22. If we do get somebody decent, we will want to sell them, or they will want to move.
You mentioned the League Cup final, mm-hmm. where Save Our Celts basically started. Was that the League Cup final that Elliott scored in?
I think it was, I think it was. So obviously on the Friday night they had sacked Brian Dempsey. And then the preparation for the Cup was, you know, it was basically, here we go again, you know, Navy, a big game especially. And that game, you know, we played okay, given what it was, but just the same old failings coming back, you know, can't take the chances, that much pressure in a game, trying to, you know, 1-0 up, looking good, and we changed things. And, you know, I can remember the substitutions and thinking we were doing okay here, and then all of a sudden we're getting beat 2-1.
It was cold and it was wet.
Oh, it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible.
Jack Anosky missed a 1-on-1. I remember that pivotal moment. So you've got this idea, this sense, things are not good. The communications are a wee bit more difficult. We're doing it through fanzines and mm-hmm. phoning each other up, etc. And you've had your meeting with a dozen guys. You mentioned there that you didn't quite achieve what you set out to. What was your objectives at that point?
I think, the first objective was to get a kind of line of communication with the board to, and it wouldn't matter where you sit talking about Celtic. The communication with the fans has never been there. It's not there today. And it certainly wasn't there back then. Now, the difference today is obviously shareholders and people have got a voice at an AGM and they'll say, well, that way. But there's the representation of the fans, the people that are always going to be there, that continuity that takes everything through has never been heard at Celtic. And it probably would be the one club that you think actually would depend more than the fans on anything else. Because if we don't go to watch Celtic, we don't go to watch anybody. Mm-hmm. And whereas some teams, some other clubs, they'll go and watch like junior football or the local team, I wouldn't watch anybody else but Celtic. So I just felt that, the first thing would be trying to get that dialogue, but it became quite clear early doors with like Chris White and so on that they would want nothing to do with us. We were embarrassment, basically.
He said that in a letter.
Yeah, he did.
He actually called you an embarrassment to the club.
Yeah.
I think one of the things round about that time was the press were quite gleeful in telling us the predicament that we were in, which was completely different from what happened 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Were the press helpful with you? Did they give you the publicity that you wanted? Or
yeah, you've double-edged sword here, isn't it? Because on one hand, you need them because how else can you get your message through? So we were depending on them picking up news stories. We were dependent on them, maybe letting us call the phone in to have a chat to them to let them know that what we were doing and to give the address of the PO box that we had to get people to write to back then, and we stamped addressed envelopes, very Blue Peter. So it was that kind of stuff. But Hugh Keevans, when I listened to the podcast with him, and Hughes was, really, he was great with us. Again, he lived in Clydebank, so kind of knew of Hugh through other people, through my mate Andy McGarvey and his brother, put me in touch with Hugh. And I took Hugh to various things. He couldn't drive, so I would pick him up at his house and chat to him on the way to events and meetings and whatever, at Shettleston Hall, and just give him an insight of, exactly what we were doing. So he was very sympathetic. James Traynor, again, when I think it was the Herald he was writing at the time, he was a different animal back then. And again, gave us, most of the coverage that we needed. But I suppose experience tells you that there's another side of that as well, because Rangers are flagging high and you've got a story about the fan pressure on Celtic and about how bad the Celtic board are, that for them is good news. That'll sell a newspaper.
Jim, as you know, Jim Orr was on the show, and Jim provided us with some fantastic footage from the time. And you mentioned there Shettleston Halls. Was that the first meeting that you got the fans together for?
Yeah, so we done 2 there, but the very first one was, I'm sure, was at the start of 91 or 92. Again, read about that, maybe January 92. I'd got a letter from Tommy Burns, so Tommy wrote to me, and it was a lovely letter, handwritten, 3-4 pages long, just sitting there telling us, look, if you're going to do this, you need to do it right. You need to remember you're representing Celtic. Now, he's manager at Kilmarnock at the time. He's got no vested interest in other than he's a fan.
Yeah.
It says, when you're there, conduct yourself the way that it's got to be done, and if you can, get Brian Dempsey on board. But kind of all this had been preempted because Brian Dempsey had already phoned us and get in touch with us and says, look, whatever you need, if you need finance to get halls or anything like that, or anything at all, let me know. He says there's money there. So yeah, I mean that was the first point. So I think we were a bit naive, but kind of looking at how we wanted to portray it, and it was an invite only. And I'm sure Matt McGlone puts it in his book that you can't have a revolution by invite. And people just they do it. But it was the first time we'd never done it before. We were being told, by the police that 500 people, you need to steward it, you need to do this. So we'd never done it. So we thought, well, okay, we need to do this, so we'll do that. Bit naive, maybe a bit too honest. Whereas if we had just said, right, there's a meeting, people come, but back without social media, just to get a flash mob like that is impossible. You had to advertise it, and a month in advance, basically.
It's interesting watching the footage because we spotted Stevie Murray in the crowd. Stephen Murray, who's quite prolific on Twitter and has obviously written a couple of books on Celtic, and he's sitting there with a full head of hair, looking every inch 1991. It's brilliant. But of course, the spotlight then, Willie, seemed to then go on you. It was almost as if you were the voice of this movement. How did you find that? Was that a wee bit nerve-wracking from a guy who's a working man? Who wants the best for his club? All of a sudden you're getting interviewed by the news channels.
Aye, I was completely fish out of water. No idea what it would entail, and No expectation on it, no PR background or anything like that. I was just a guy working in the railways, doing, shifts and whatever, working my whole life around trying to get to Celtic games. That was it. And ever since I'd been, left school and started work, that's all. Just how do I get to the Celtic game this week, and how do I need to swap shifts, and all that kind of stuff. So to be put in that kind of spotlight was completely unusual, and pictures in the back of newspapers at Shettleston halls and things like that. You're not expecting it. You're not turning up there thinking, oh, somebody's going to ask to take a picture of me and have fans behind me and things like that. So it was a bit surreal, but it's just somebody had to do it.
Yeah,
and. I think we sat and talked about that when we got the hardcore, they kind of almost like a committee together. So there was Jim, Duncan Hart, Davy Ashman, and myself and a guy called Brian Mullen. We sat and we thought, well, who wants to do this? How do we do it? And it wasn't so much short straws, but, it's kind of, it just seemed like, the guys were saying to me, you do it. And I think Jim might have been, probably a better speaker, but it ended up with myself.
Mm-hmm. And again, the footage is fantastic, because what you've got there is you've got a table with people like Joe Beltrami.
Mm-hmm.
So how did the Joe Beltrami appearance come about?
We'd written to every high-profile Celtic fan we could think of. So Beltrami was one of the ones that came back, and he came back saying, oh, yes, I'll do this, quite bombastic, getting in there saying, come see me at my office and we'll talk about this and how we'll save Celtic. And he turns up on the day and he just takes over. So here's a professional that's well known and used to standing, a really good speaker, and really, wouldn't need a microphone to address, 500-600 people in a hall. But yeah, so that was it. More or less just by writing to him and then going to see him and asking him.
It sort of mirrors the famous saying, if you got lifted, get Beltrami. Celtic are in trouble, get Beltrami.
Yep, get me Beltrami. That's it. I know.
And the thing was, after we'd had him for the first one, we thought, well, we can't take him for the second one, because he just takes over the show and we don't get the message out we want. And we were quite conscious, actually, just to be like normal fans and not have a figurehead like Beltrami or Brian Dempsey from the point of view. Then it felt as if it was their movement, and we wanted to keep it separate from that. We still wanted to have that connection, just as your average fan who's got a season ticket or whatever, representing other average fans.
Me and Paul have obviously seen the videos, and Terry Cassidy appeared at one of your
That was the second
rallies.
one, yeah.
That was the second one. How did you find him?
Again, he was paid to do a job. And the job that he was paid to do, you could argue that he'd done it terribly, because where did Celtic end up by the time he had finished with them? It was an absolute mess. And the PR when he was there was, how can you put it? He was a pantomime villain for everybody, and he played it to perfection.
He did.
He absolutely played it. And even at that rally, when he's there and he's talking to people, I was sitting watching the crowd, and I could see that he had half the crowd in the palm of his hand. And I'm thinking, these are our fans that are here to try and remove the board. So, he was very good at what he'd done. The way that he'd done it, obviously, it didn't suit us from a point of view for the momentum that we were trying to create. And I dare say that the way that he rubbed the press up, even though as Celtic fans we love to see the press getting a bloody nose, the reality was the way that he was portrayed and whatever from Celtic was probably, he was never going to get a good press of anybody in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned momentum there. It seems like very quickly from you guys getting together and handing out the leaflets and getting a few people unhappy with you doing that. The reaction you got wasn't universal at that stage. You've set up the halls. That got you a lot of press coverage. It started to appear on the back pages. As you say, the high-profile Joe Beltrami gets his weight behind it. You then get the club to engage by sending Terry Cassidy, something they said they wouldn't do after calling you an embarrassment. After your second meeting at the halls, what was your next steps? Where did you go from there?
We kind of thought about the boycotts. We talked about it. And the point was that we thought, well, how would we feel if somebody says to me, you can't go to a game? Guys are working all week. Probably the only pleasure some of these guys might have is going to watch Celtic on a Saturday. And for us to turn around and say to them, look, don't go to the game. It might be hard, but you need to miss the next 4 home games. Just don't go, but we'll get where we want to be here. We didn't have the mandate because of the numbers. We as I say, we could never get more than the 500-600 people subscribing to the newsletter, coming to the rallies, and we needed more than that. And there was a kind of two-way communication between the people that signed up. They were writing to us and were saying, you should maybe try this, try that. But there was never a call for a boycott. We just didn't think that the appetite was there. And I do think, just looking at it, as you can after years, and even, maybe 5-6 years after it, we were maybe a year too early. Maybe just a year too early. We probably jumped the gun on that, because if we came in a year later and stayed a year longer, and with the likes of Brendan, as I say, getting involved with Celts for Change, if he'd been there, coming forward and taking on board with us and the other people that came, then there could have been that kind of change. But again, that's just one of those things.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting again that people set up a Facebook group or a website or a Twitter page. Back then it was basically putting a newsletter together that you were sending out to these 500-600 people. When did all that stop? When did you realise the train stopped and you can't go any further?
Again, results were improving. So, mentioned beating Rangers a couple of times in a week. I think McCarry came in, pretty decent run to start with, things like that, So, I think there was a period we went, between cup games, Europe and the league, and 12, 15, 16 games, we never get beat.
So many false dawns.
There was, and, you can kind of see that, but, other people are thinking, well, do you know what, I think we're through the worst. It's going to be okay.
Aye.
It's going to be okay when you talk to people and they're saying, well, you know what, it's been a few months now, everything's fine. They seem to have listened, but you kind of knew in the back of the head, you think, you know what, I've seen this before. It's going to come back to bite us.
Particularly when you look at, if we go back to 86, the Scottish football revolution, that was not a revolution.
No.
Celtic followed that up. They went into debt for the first time with a new fascia at Celtic Park. They then went into major debt with regards to buying players for $1 million, 1.5, etc. Because there was £4 million plus signings under Liam Brady.
Yeah.
So Celtic were now in a position where our Italian football hero wasn't as good as theirs, because Souness had a level of success, we didn't. So we're now in a worse situation where we're still not winning trophies and we're now in debt. You mentioned earlier, and it's something that would be really interested to hear more about, Brendan being the link between the two movements, if you like. How did Brendan come into the equation, and how was he then able to link up with Matt for Celts for Change? Yeah,
so over the course of the couple of years that we've been doing Save Our Celts, I would see Brendan on a regular basis, just through work, chat to him, and Brendan was right on the same page as myself whenever I would chat to him. He just watched it from far, never actually got involved, but we decided then, I think around about late 82, that late 92, early 93 or whatever, that was it. We couldn't take it any further. We went as far as we could go, and we were calling it a day, because the people, I'm not saying our own heart wasn't in it, but we just couldn't get that momentum going on. And I got a phone call one night from Brendan just saying, look, I want to do something. I'm looking to do it. Do you fancy just picking up the reins again and doing it? And I kind of, hummed and hawed, and I thought, well, let me think about it. I'll get your phone back. And I called him back and I said, look, I just don't think the fans want to do it. I honestly don't. I says, but talk to Matt McGlone. And I gave him Matt's number. I says, Matt is desperately keen to do something.
At this time, Matt was
Once
editor
Once
a Tim, which was, for what I can remember, a bit more militant than what Not the View was at that point.
Yeah, because met Matt a couple of times, and he was wanting to put posters up around about Glasgow or various, just directors, guilty of gross mismanagement, things like that, and just have them, at various points throughout the town. And, it was a kind of propaganda war and kind of almost a guerrilla war that Matt had in mind. And again, looking at that, it did have to be something quite radical. But as I say, I put Brendan in touch with Matt, and I think just having Brendan having that kind of drive, and Matt having the kind of ideas that he had, and obviously, I mean, you've maybe read his book and whatever, but, they were able to take it to another level.
So do you think your approach was very much, you were writing to people, you were asking in that respect, and this was far more rebellious, if you like?
Yeah, I think they were certainly a lot more radical and rebellious. I think from our point of view, we were a pressure group. We were trying to highlight the issues constantly to people, talk to people, try to spread the word, and just start something, just get something without knowing where it could go. Whereas I think when the next step, and the natural step onto that, you had something to build on. You had a kind of a core of disenfranchised, and you could take that somewhere. And then obviously the results under Macari dived very quickly. So within 3 or 4 months of us stopping it, we couldn't just then say, we'll start up again because his results are going bad. It was like, well, let's just see how this goes. But by that point, Brendan, Matt and whatever had decided that, that the next step was on, and Celts for Change had kind of grown, and it grew very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Were you able to get involved in any way, Willie, or were you quite happy by that stage that it was in good hands and you could just support them as best you can?
Yeah, I was more than happy. My first son had been born, so things were going well in work, buying a house, all that kind of stuff, and I thought, do you know what, I'm going to spend time here rather than being out 7 nights a week trying to get things and just see how it goes. But I thought they'd done brilliantly, and even the night, going back to that night in March in 1994 where the Rebels had won, myself and Brian Mullen were standing out in the car park just in the rain, just, watching it and so happy that it had happened,
Did you get a sense that although you weren't part of that particular movement, the seeds had been sown a couple of years before with you guys? And then obviously there's that very important link between Save Our Celts, Brendan and Celts for Change.
Aye.
You must have felt a great sense of pride.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it was fans that had done it. And even though some of the fans were fans with a lot of money, so whether it be Brian Dempsey or John Keane or Fergus, obviously, who, could never have been done without him. I don't think anybody's in any two doubts about that. It was fans, though. This is the thing, that no matter who those fans were, whether they had £1 in their pocket or £1 million, it was the fans that saved Celtic. That was it. End of. You don't have to look at anybody else and say, thank God, that multi-millionaire from Saudi Arabia came in. We didn't need to do that. Celtic fans came in and saved the club.
You mentioned Fergus and the fact that it's 25 years since the takeover. During your period of Save Our Celts, was there any inclination that this wee guy from Canada, because I know he'd been in and around the club late 80s looking for a deal to be struck, were you aware of Fergus McCann?
Yeah, he actually wrote to us, and I think it was Jim that got the letter and basically put his proposal about how he could refinance Celtic, and included the very successful share issue. So basically says, this is how I would do it, this is what I would do. Talked about building a stadium on the current ground, 55, 60,000 people. He basically put his blueprint out to us about 2 years before he even, started being a regular figure at Celtic Park. I'm sure Jim will have that letter, he'll have the correspondence. It might even be a telegraph for all I know, a telegram I should say.
Yeah, because he's given us all the newsletters,
Aye.
all the video footage. It's interesting reading, very much so. So obviously it's come good through the fan pressure movements, Save Our Celts, and everybody's working together by that stage, because obviously Matt's working with David Lowe, who's the link into Fergus, and everybody's working together. What we're seeing now, Willie, a successful club based on very, very strong foundations. The balance sheet is always very positive. There's 1 million fans come through the door last season. Is that Fergus's legacy?
I think it is. I don't think, as I say, the only thing that I would have wanted different is probably fan representation on the board. And for me, for that to work, you couldn't have one fan on the board forever, because they just become part of the board, become part of the issues that fans have. I think you would have to have an election from the fans to put somebody on every 2 years maximum to try and get something done. So that would be the only thing. Everything else, looking at the way the club is, the way it's structured, it goes back to Fergus. The one thing I would say would be different is, I suppose, if we look at Rangers and obviously the new club that's there, Fergus would have wanted them in the Premier League to start with, but I think he would have made quite sure from the start that they would be known as a new club, just taking the old club's place. Yeah, you could argue till you're blue in the face of whether you're as a club, Celtic need Rangers. Now they showed for the best part of 5-6 years that they competed well, especially in Europe, without them. But the reality is that under Ronnie, that there was empty seats, so. Crowds didn't turn up 40,000. I remember sitting at in fact I think it was a midweek or maybe a couple of midweeks before they get beat by Rangers or drew with Rangers in the semi-final, knocked out in penalties, and we played Dundee in a midweek game. It was nothing each. I'm sitting there, so we're into the last kind of 6-8 weeks of Ronnie Dahlia's reign, and I think there's 20,000 people in the stadium if you're lucky on a Wednesday night. It's horrible, nothing each game. I'm sitting there and I'm looking around, I'm thinking, Christ, I never thought I'd see this again. When we're going to win the league, it's different if you're sitting there under, Joe Venglos or something like that, and you've lost the league by January or whatever, and you're sitting there towards the end of the season, nobody's turned up. We were going to win the league, and there's 20,000 people, and it was a dreadful game of football. But that was a reality, and I think that maybe made people think, well, look, something needs to change here.
Obviously, we're talking about Fergus's legacy, and Fergus's legacy started with the fanzines. The fanzines brought you into play, Jim Orr, Save Our Celts, Celts for Change and that. You mentioned that it was all self-addressed envelopes, it was all newsletters, it was all handing out leaflets at the game. For me, the football landscape's going to change in the next 10 years. There's going to be a cross-European league. If Celtic get into a cross-European league, that then opens us up to be taken over by a sovereign wealth, oil money, a Chinese hedge fund. Say we get to this point where we're going to get, say, a country who violates human rights interested in taking over Celtic to boost their image. Do you think a movement like Save Our Celts would start and would survive to try and stop that happening?
The example that you give is probably one of the examples that there might be a chance for fans to really do something. So if say we, a wealthy Israeli company or Arab company came in and took over, and they had a hell of a human rights process. I think that's maybe the one thing that would maybe unify Celtic fans to that point of view. If it was just somebody, some multi-millionaire steel mogul from, say, America or Canada or Australia that had none of that, and they came in, I don't think anybody would care. But, I think a lot of the older fans, guys at my age, would think, this isn't the way, this isn't, how Celtic should be. But I don't think there would be a movement as such against that. I don't think younger fans would particularly care if it meant that Celtic were, playing in the same kind of field as your PSGs and so on. I honestly don't think they would care.
There is that sense of if you're being entertained or if you're winning games, everything else just kind of goes out the window, Willie. And you've seen that back in the early 90s. A great point Kevin's made before when we were talking to Jim was if a movement was to be necessary, and we did see it in Glasgow fairly recently, in the not too distant past, with all of the wealth of communication that we now have, would it actually be more difficult to get that hardcore to see something through?
Yeah. In that aspect, what we done and what the Celtic fans had done in the early 90s couldn't be done now. I don't think.
You mention what happened across the city, and you look what they've tried to do. They vet themselves. Yeah. There's that many different supporters groups fighting each other, and they're still fighting each other, even though it looks like they're more successful on the pitch, even though that's probably more down to us having a poor season rather than anything.
Very much so.
But they're still infighting because of the scale of social media, the fact that everybody's got an opinion.
Yes.
And somebody says one thing, other people jump in. But it's usually the person with the most outlandish view gets the most airtime.
Yeah. So back then, if you think about it, if you wanted to do something, you had to get off your backside and do it, or at very least buy a stamp and an envelope and post it and put your view to somebody and tell them exactly how you felt. Whereas now you just pick up your phone and you can like something or make a comment, and so you put that in the hands of 100,000 people, you're going to get and it will be polarised to one side saying, "Oh, do that," and other people saying, "Why are we bothering with these guys? These guys are tossers. What do they know?" And that's it. So it would be undermined before it even started. It would really need to be to the point where we would have to be on our knees and that kind of, by the way, if we don't do something tonight, tomorrow we're shut. So we need everybody to get up and give £1,000 or something like that.
Come together. Just right up to date, we're now looking, you started following Celtic when we were in the realms of 9 in a row. We've never seen such success until now. We're in the midst of making even more history. Are you now quite happy just to go back to being one of the fans that wears the scarf and goes to the game? And how much are you enjoying it now, Willie?
I mean, the last 2 seasons have been brilliant, haven't they? And it's quite funny, we're talking about how fickle fans are. I mean, the reaction at the beginning of this season to a couple of defeats, and but we should have won against AEK Athens. We should have done. It was a pretty poor performance, and losing Dembele when we did, and obviously Bayata down in tools are horrible things. But other clubs have to deal with that. And we weren't best prepared for it, and we could have been better prepared for it. And that gets down to our signing policies and the type of players that we've got. So there is an issue there about the type of players that we're signing. There is an issue about the type of money that we're spending, given that we are cash rich. That still needs to be addressed. It might get addressed in the next window. So I think that's something that we need to be kind of conscious of, and fans, I think, are quite right to probe the club on this. But the success we've had, I'd never known anything like it. Double treble. And even the first treble, that when that goal, that day at Hampden, the Tom Rogic goal goes in, I've never experienced anything like that in a long time at football.
I still get goosebumps.
It's great. It's absolutely brilliant. It's just that day and how it all worked out. It's still one of my favourite moments watching Celtic, and there's many.
Willie Wilson, with a Celtic State of Mind. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Willie. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers, guys.